Imagine a distant time, an era when the world was still young, and the earth was full of life and promise. But above, in the heavens, there was a silent conflict, a rebellion that would change the fate of humanity forever. The angels, celestial beings of incomparable beauty and power, had a clear mission: to watch over the earth and protect God's creation. But as they observed the children of men, something unusual began to happen. Some of these angels, captivated by the beauty of the daughters of men, began to feel desires that should not exist among celestial beings. In their hearts, something dark was born, a forbidden attraction, a desire to descend to earth and unite with these mortal women. And so it happened. These angels, who would later be known as the Watchers, made the bold decision to abandon their place in the heavens. They descended to earth, disguised as men, yet carrying the power and glory of celestial beings. They mingled with humans, took wives for themselves, and from this union, the Nephilim were born. The Nephilim were not like humans. They were giants, both in stature and strength, possessing abilities beyond human comprehension. They were beings that combined divine nature with mortality, and their emergence marked the beginning of a time of great turmoil on earth. But this act of rebellion did not go unnoticed by God. The balance of creation was threatened, and the Nephilim, with their dark origins, would bring devastating consequences for humanity. This is the story of the beginning of the Nephilim, a story that marks the dawn of an era when the world would know a new form of evil and a new challenge for the survival of what was still pure in creation. The Nephilim were a sight no one could forget. Imagine creatures that far surpassed any human in height and strength, with eyes that blazed like fire and voices that echoed like thunder. These were the characteristics that made the Nephilim true giants, both physically and spiritually. But who were these enigmatic beings, really? The Nephilim were not just the product of a forbidden union. They were a mix of two worlds, the celestial and the earthly. They were the offspring of the fallen angels, the Watchers, and the daughters of men. They carried the celestial power of their fathers, but also the human heart of their mothers. And this combination made them different from any other creature that had ever walked the earth. The Nephilim possessed extraordinary abilities. They were incredibly strong, capable of feats no human could match. Their voices could command legions, and their gazes, it was said, could pierce the soul of a man. They were formidable warriors, feared by all who encountered them, but they were also beings with a rebellious and untamable nature. The power they possessed came from the heavens, but the corruption of the human heart manifested in their actions. Unlike humans, who lived in harmony with creation, the Nephilim saw the world as something to be conquered. They built great cities, erected gigantic monuments in their own honor, and led nations to war under their command. They knew no limits to their ambition and had no respect for God's laws. To them, the world was an arena where they could exercise their power and satisfy their desires. But with all their power, the Nephilim also carried a curse. Being the offspring of fallen angels, their very existence was a challenge to the divine order. They were, in essence, aberrations in creation, beings that should never have existed. And with this rebellious nature, they brought chaos and destruction wherever they went. Despite all the terror they inspired, the Nephilim were not invulnerable. There was a prophecy that foretold their end, that a great judgment awaited them. But until that day came, the Nephilim reigned over the earth, spreading their influence and shaping the world in their image. These giants, half angel, half human, were more than mere monsters. They were the symbol of an era of disorder, a time when the boundaries between the sacred and the profane were broken, and the earth encountered a kind of power humanity had never seen before. The presence of the Nephilim transformed life on earth in ways no one could have imagined. When these giants walked among men, the world, once full of peace and harmony, began to change. What was once a simple and peaceful life now became a daily struggle for survival, marked by fear and oppression. The Nephilim knew no compassion. They ruled with an iron fist, imposing their will on people, taking whatever they wanted without concern for the consequences. Entire cities were forced to bow before them, and the peoples of the earth lived under constant threat. Anyone who dared to challenge the Nephilim faced an overwhelming force, capable of destroying armies and toppling fortifications in moments. Life under the rule of the Nephilim was a mixture of terror and servitude. Ordinary people were forced to work for these giants, building their immense cities, cultivating their fields, and offering them tributes. Legends speak of grand palaces, made of stone and gold, erected in honor of the Nephilim, monuments to their greatness and power. But these same palaces were also somber reminders of the oppression and suffering they brought. Despite all their power, the Nephilim also faced challenges. They were not immortal, and their lives, though long, were not free from the pains and trials of earthly existence. There were internal struggles among them, disputes for control and supremacy. And often, these conflicts resulted in epic battles that shook the earth and left a trail of destruction. The Nephilim, however, were not just cruel tyrants. Some accounts suggest that there was a certain fascination people felt for these powerful beings. In their eyes, the Nephilim represented the pinnacle of creation, a mix of divine and human that, while feared, was also revered. Some tribes even worshipped the Nephilim as gods, offering them sacrifices in hopes of gaining their protection or favor. But despite attempts to appease them, the Nephilim continued to spread chaos and destruction. Their dominion over the earth brought about an era of darkness, where corruption and violence became the norm. Under their reign, the earth became filled with sin, and humanity began to drift further away from the ways of God. Life with the Nephilim was a life under a constant shadow, where fear reigned and hope seemed distant. They represented the height of earthly power, but also the spiritual downfall of humanity, which found itself increasingly distant from the purity and goodness that once guided its steps. It was a time when the weak had no voice, and justice was a distant memory. And while the Nephilim ruled, the earth cried out for redemption, for a return to an order that seemed increasingly unreachable. As the Nephilim consolidated their rule over the earth, the world began to change irreversibly. Corruption was no longer the exception but the rule. The cities that were once sanctuaries of life and community now became fortresses of decadence, where evil grew like weeds. And at the heart of this darkness was the influence of the Nephilim. The Nephilim, with their immense strength and near-divine power, quickly corrupted humanity. Under their influence, men and women began to imitate their ways, adopting violence, lust, and greed as their new gods. God's laws were forgotten, replaced by an insatiable pursuit of power and pleasure. The Nephilim, seeing humans bow to their will, felt invincible, as if the very world was at their mercy. The earth, which once reflected the beauty and order of divine creation, was now plunged into chaos. The evil of the Nephilim spread like a plague, reaching every corner. Wars between tribes became common, encouraged by the Nephilim themselves, who saw war as a form of entertainment. Violence was not only tolerated but celebrated, and human life lost its value. Over time, the corruption of the Nephilim even reached nature itself. Crops withered, animals became ferocious, and the elements seemed to be in constant turmoil. The earth, like a living being, began to show signs that it could no longer bear the weight of the sin that had been placed upon it. The waters of the rivers became murky, the soil turned barren, and the skies, once clear and bright, were now frequently covered by dark and threatening clouds. But it wasn't just the earth that suffered. The human heart itself was in decline. Families, once the foundation of society, were crumbling under the weight of greed and selfishness. Justice and righteousness were seen as weaknesses, while cunning and cruelty were rewarded. The priests who once guided the people in God's ways were now silent, fearing the wrath of the Nephilim. In this environment of decadence, the cries of humanity reached the heavens. The pain, suffering, and injustice were so great that the prayers of the righteous began to echo in the heavenly courts. God, seeing the devastation caused by the Nephilim and the corruption they spread, knew that something had to be done. The earth, which he had created to be a place of life and prosperity, was on the brink of destruction. It was at this moment that God began to plan a great purification, an act of justice that would restore order and sanctity to the world. The flood, an inevitable judgment, was approaching, and with it, the fate of the Nephilim and all who had succumbed to the corruption they brought. But until this judgment came, the earth would continue to sink into its own corruption, and humanity, under the rule of the Nephilim, would drift further away from the light and grace of God. It was a time of darkness, where hope seemed lost and redemption distant. As the earth plunged deeper into darkness, there was one man who stood out amidst the widespread corruption: Noah. Unlike his contemporaries, Noah was a righteous and blameless man, someone who still walked with God, remaining faithful to the principles and values that his ancestors had followed. He and his family represented a rare glimmer of light in a world dominated by darkness. God, observing the earth and seeing that the wickedness of humanity was great and that every thought of the human heart was continually evil, decided that it was time to act. The world, corrupted by the Nephilim and the iniquity of men, needed to be purified. But amid all this wickedness, Noah found favor in the eyes of God. One night, as Noah reflected on the decay around him, he heard the voice of God. The Creator revealed to Noah his plan to put an end to the corruption and bring a new beginning to the world. God explained that he would send a great flood, a deluge that would cover the entire earth and destroy everything that had been corrupted. The flood would be a way to cleanse the earth, eradicating evil and giving humanity a new chance. But God did not want Noah, a righteous man, to perish along with the wicked. So he gave Noah a mission: to build an ark, a great boat that would be capable of sheltering Noah, his family, and a pair of every species of animal on earth. The ark would be the means of salvation amid the impending destruction. God was clear in his instructions. He detailed exactly how the ark should be built, its dimensions, the type of wood to be used, and even the number of internal compartments. It was a monumental task, but Noah, obedient and faithful, began to work immediately, despite the disbelief and mockery of his neighbors. As the construction progressed, Noah also preached to the people, warning them of the judgment that was coming and inviting them to repent. But most mocked him, ignoring the signs of the impending disaster. As the ark took shape, the Nephilim continued with their lives, indifferent to Noah's warning. They considered themselves invincible, believing that no power, not even God's, could destroy them. They continued their conquests, spreading evil and violence, unaware that their time was running out. Finally, when the ark was ready, God commanded Noah to gather his family and the animals and enter the ark. The time for the flood was near, and then something surprising happened. The gates of heaven opened, and the springs of the great deep burst forth. The rain began to fall, not as a common storm, but as an unrelenting deluge, a destructive force that would cover the entire earth. The flood was not just a flood, but an act of divine judgment, a response to the corruption that had spread across the world. As the waters rose, the Nephilim and all who had followed their ways perished. Only Noah, his family, and the animals he had brought into the ark were spared, floating above the waters as the world below them was purified. This was Noah's great calling, a story of obedience, faith, and salvation. He and his family, chosen by God, became the bearers of a new covenant, the seed of a new beginning for humanity, in a world where the corruption of the Nephilim had finally been eradicated. When the waters began to fall from the heavens and pour forth from the depths of the earth, the world changed within hours. The flood, relentless and overwhelming, consumed everything on the surface of the earth. Mighty mountains were submerged, cities and villages disappeared under the weight of the waters, and the earth, once vibrant and full of life, became an endless ocean. Inside the ark, Noah and his family witnessed the devastating power of the flood. The ark, rocking on the turbulent waters, became their safe refuge amid the chaos. As the winds howled and the waters rose, Noah knew that the world he had known was being erased, and with it, the Nephilim and the corruption they had brought to the world. The flood was not just an inundation but an act of divine purification. The Nephilim, who had proclaimed themselves invincible, faced for the first time a force they could not dominate. They, who had caused so much fear and destruction, were now powerless before divine justice. The waters engulfed them, and their gigantic bodies were swept away by the currents, sinking into the depths of the ocean that now covered the earth. The flood lasted 40 days and 40 nights, but even after the rain stopped, the waters remained over the earth for many months. The ark continued to float, carrying Noah, his family, and the animals to an unknown destiny. During this time, Noah and his family reflected on what had happened. They had witnessed the end of an era, God's judgment on the corruption and wickedness that had spread across the world. Finally, after many months, the waters began to recede. The highest mountains began to emerge, and the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat. Noah, after sending out a dove that returned with an olive branch, knew that the earth was drying and that the time to leave the ark was near. When the doors of the ark opened, Noah and his family stepped out into a completely transformed world. Everything around them was new, clean, and fresh, as if the earth had been reborn. The corruption that the Nephilim had brought had been washed away, and the world was now a blank canvas ready for a new beginning. Noah, in gratitude, built an altar and offered sacrifices to God. And God, in response, made a covenant with Noah and his descendants, promising never again to destroy the earth with a flood. As a sign of this covenant, God placed a rainbow in the skies, a symbol of peace and his eternal promise. The destruction of the Nephilim and the purification of the earth marked the end of an era of chaos and the beginning of a new journey for humanity. From that moment on, the world would have the chance to start anew, free from the corruption that had almost destroyed it. But, as Noah knew, this new chance also came with the responsibility to live according to God's laws, to prevent the world from falling again into the darkness that the Nephilim had brought. Now, the earth was ready to flourish again, and humanity, reborn, had before it the opportunity to build a world that honored the justice, peace, and goodness that God had always desired for his creation. After the flood, when the earth had been purified and Noah and his family began to repopulate the world, a lingering question hung in the air. Had the Nephilim truly been completely wiped out? Most believed that the flood had eradicated all traces of these corrupt giants. But as time passed, rumors began to circulate. Generations after the flood, stories of giants still walking the earth began to emerge. These accounts, often passed down orally, spoke of beings of immense stature, powerful in strength, and feared by those who encountered them. Could these giants be remnants of the Nephilim? And if so, how could they have survived the total destruction that the flood brought? The Bible mentions that, in times after the flood, there were still giants in some regions. One of the most well-known examples is the giants encountered by the Israelites when they were about to enter the Promised Land. When Moses sent spies to explore Canaan, he received reports that the inhabitants of the land were giants, so tall and strong that the spies felt like grasshoppers beside them. These giants, known as the Anakim, were described as descendants of the Nephilim, raising many doubts and fears among the Israelites. But how could these giants still exist? One theory suggests that, despite the flood eliminating most of the Nephilim, some might have survived in mysterious ways, or that the evil they represented could have resurfaced through new acts of celestial rebellion. Another possibility is that after the flood, new fallen angels repeated the sin of the Watchers, creating a new lineage of giants. Regardless of their origin, the presence of these giants after the flood suggested that evil still persisted, albeit on a smaller scale. The battle between good and evil had not ended with the flood, but continued to manifest in different forms throughout history. The Israelites, under Joshua's leadership, eventually faced these giants in battle, and with God's help, they were able to defeat them. However, the fact that these beings still existed after the flood served as a grim reminder that the corruption the Nephilim brought to the world was resilient and persistent, requiring constant vigilance from humanity. Thus, the Nephilim became a legend, a cautionary tale about what happens when creation strays from the path laid out by God. They were proof that evil can be fought but must never be underestimated. For, as history has shown, it can re-emerge when least expected. The question of whether the Nephilim survived the flood, then, is not just about the physical presence of these giants, but about the legacy of evil and corruption they left behind. A legacy that, despite efforts at purification, would continue to challenge humanity in its journey to live according to God's will. Over the centuries, the story of the Nephilim transformed into myth and legend, but their presence, in some form, continued to resonate in the memory of humanity. Even after the flood and the defeat of the last giants who walked the earth, the influence of the Nephilim did not completely disappear. Their deeds, their strength, and most notably, the corruption they brought, left deep marks that persisted in the collective imagination of future generations. Ancient peoples, when recounting their stories, often mentioned powerful beings of immense stature who inhabited eras long past. In cultures around the world, from the Middle East to the Americas, tales emerged of giants who dominated the land and were responsible for great constructions or unmatched feats of strength. Although each culture shaped these stories in its own way, the figure of the giant, often associated with the Nephilim, continued to be a symbol of corrupted power. But the legend of the Nephilim was not confined to mere tales and legends. Their legacy also impacted religious beliefs and practices. Many believed that the Nephilim, as beings who transgressed divine laws, symbolized the ongoing struggle between good and evil, between obedience to God and rebellion. Their stories were used as warnings, teaching that the pursuit of power and the satisfaction of forbidden desires leads to destruction and divine judgment. Moreover, the figure of the Nephilim inspired the idea that evil can take on grand and seductive forms but is ultimately destructive and self-destructive. Thus, the Nephilim became a symbol of what happens when one ignores God's will and succumbs to corruption. To many, they represented the dangers of arrogance and disobedience, a constant reminder that the choices made in life have eternal consequences. At the same time, the legend of the Nephilim also fueled curiosity and speculation over the centuries. Historians, theologians, and scholars debated the true nature of these beings and what their existence meant for humanity. Some saw them as mere myth, while others believed that the Nephilim were proof that the spiritual and physical worlds are deeply interconnected, with consequences beyond what we can comprehend. Even today, the legend of the Nephilim continues to fascinate and intrigue. They appear in books, films, and conspiracy theories, as a distant echo of a time when giants walked the earth. For many, the Nephilim remain an unresolved mystery, a shadow from the past that still casts long darkness over the collective imagination. Thus, the legacy of the Nephilim persists, not as beings of flesh and blood, but as a lasting reminder of the dangers of corrupted power and transgression against divine laws. They are part of a larger story, the story of humanity and its constant struggle to remain faithful to what is good and just, resisting the forces that seek to divert it from the right path. The earth may have been purified by the flood, but the memory of the Nephilim and what they represented has never completely disappeared. They live on in legends, in stories, and in warnings that continue to be passed down from generation to generation, as proof of the lasting impact that evil can have, even when it seems to be defeated.